All right. Welcome to the June virtual meetup, everybody. In case you're new, I'm Eric Smith. I'm the editor of the Dispatcher's Office for the Operation SIG. If you're an OpSig member, watch your mail. If you get the printed copy, it may already be in your hands. Otherwise, it'll be in your hands this week. Digital copy will be released on the 15th. So watch your email for that. As a reminder, both print and digital subscribers have access to all of our digital copies as a benefit of membership. So with that said, Dave Husman is going to be presenting today. So Dave, you should have permission to share. You're good to go.
Okay. All right. Hopefully you can see the screen there.
Yep, it's coming through fine.
All right. Howdy, everybody. My name is Dave Husman, and I'm going to be presenting on building a consist and locomotive management. This will be some prototype perspective from my career and various things. Actually, I'd like to start off a little bit differently in that the first thing I'm going to tell you is everything I'm going to tell you is wrong. At least I guarantee you'll be able to find exceptions to it and people that will say, oh, we didn't do it that way, because locomotive management and how a railroad takes care of their engines is policy. And so it varies from railroad to railroad. It varies by era. It's set by whoever's in charge. So if they change who the vice president of transportation is, the locomotive management and how they arrange things could change in an instant. So I guarantee you're going to be able to find something that will be contrary to what I'm going to say, but this is based on my experiences working for a railroad. What we're going to discuss is managing the fleet, how engines are selected, looked at a timeline for how the power flows, how the power flows through the service track, what they do there, talk a little bit about shopping engines, and then throughout the presentation and also the modeling of the locomotive management and the locomotive flows. So we'll start off and we'll talk about the fleet in general, all the locomotives that a railroad owns. Railroads own different types of engines and that compose the fleet, and they have different attributes, different horsepower, and they may optimize the tractive effort, or they may optimize speed or fuel economy, different things like that. They have different wheel arrangements, and that affects the tractive effort. It affects the axle loading for light bridges and that. And then there are all sorts of extras that railroads buy to put on their engines, dynamic brakes, DPU, hump controls, et cetera, et cetera. When we, back in the 1980s, when we would have a run-through train going into Canada, we couldn't put an American engine on the point because it didn't have a hot plate, and Canadian labor agreements at that time required there be a hot plate on the lead unit of the engine. So, you know, it was different things. Plus, within their entire fleet, they have little sub-fleets of engines that were bought for specific purposes. Passenger fleet with high gear ratio for high speed, and of course, boilers and head-in power. The premium freight engines will have a higher horsepower per axle for higher speed and faster acceleration. The drag freight or regular freight engines will have higher tractive effort. The local engines with 4 axles, those engines, you know, they never go away. There's some that are older than I am that are out still roaming the earth on short lines and that. Yard engines that are built specifically to be yard engines have a very specific use and a very limited use. And a lot of times you'll see where yard engines will actually be just a cascaded engine from another purpose instead of buying specific yard engines because they are so limited in use. The more you look at the more modern engines, especially where there's been the huge downturn in traffic and they've had stored a lot of engines, the differentiation breaks down because they cascade engines down through the food chain. Two aspects that we're going to talk about also are allocation. That is, how many engines are in the fleet, getting the right size. And a lot of that is determined by the number of trains they're going to run, how fast the trains run, and the turn time, how fast they can turn engines in the yards. If a railroad the size of the Union Pacific slows down, the railroad overall slows down by 1/10 of a mile an hour, it means they need 100 extra units to run their trains, because the speed of the trains and then the cycling of the engines drives the fleet size. There's also something that isn't necessarily as modelable, but what is modelable is the balancing, getting the right number of engines in the right place on the right day. Railroad operations are not balanced. Customers load different amounts of cars on different days. It peaks usually on Thursday, Friday, Saturday, and then falls into a big lull on Sunday, Monday, Tuesday. So where a terminal may need to run 15 trains on Friday, they might only have to run 8 or 10 trains on Monday. So there's big waves of trains going across the railroads, and big waves of power. So they have to keep track of how many engines am I going to get today, and is that going to be enough engines to run my program? If it's not, then they have to relocate power. Somebody has to send, that has extra engines, has to send them to the places that are at deficit. That can be either with power moves or with just accessing power. And then the flip side of that is if you have too many engines, you have to store the power. And you've seen a lot of that over the last decade as the coal business has gone down and as traffic and the economy has contracted. There's engines stored all over the place. The ideal thing is you store an engine for 30 days or more, because if you store it for 30 days, the time that it's stored doesn't count against its federal inspection sequence, where you have to, let's say you have to inspect an engine every year. If you store it for more than 30 days, that doesn't count against that year-long period. And then there's maintenance. Railroads will organize their operation to put certain manufacturers or certain models and certain services in order to facilitate maintenance, to have the machinists who are familiar with it. There are the periodic inspections, both federal and railroad, that the railroad has to inspect the engines on a regular basis, 92-day, annual, 2-year, 3-year, etc. There's failures. Locomotives are very sophisticated pieces of equipment, so there's lots of things that can break. And then they also will do maintenance for upgrades. They'll find a defect in the class X engines and then cycle all of those engines through the shop to upgrade it. And something since the 1990s, locomotives need to come in for a software update, because there are so many computer programs and so much technology on the engines, they have to be updated frequently. So railroads will buy different engines for different purposes. This GP38 on the left, that is the gold standard of local and 4-axle road switchers. It's bought by almost all railroads for that purpose. This one is particularly interesting in that it's a what they call a double bar. On the Union Pacific, they have cab signals, and on the leading end of the engine, underneath the behind the plate, they have a receiver that receives the cab signal. And so this engine has one on either end. That means that it can be operated as a single unit local in cab signal territory. Since it's got a bar on each end, it can go in either direction. The middle unit is an SD4090 43AC. It was originally intended to be an intermodal engine. As the GP38 was the gold standard in local engines, the middle engine was the gold standard in failures. The original concept was a 6,000 horsepower engine, but the engine wasn't quite ready, so the UP bought the locomotives with a SD70 4,000 horsepower engine in it. And the idea, when the 6,000 horsepower engine became ready, they just pull out the 4,000, drop in a 6,000, and away they go. The problem was that this type of engine was just fraught with problems. And as a matter of fact, the UP calculated that if they parked all of these engines and stored all of them, the average train speed would go up and the net amount of horsepower available would go up, because these engines delayed so many trains due to road failures. Well, most of them have been sold off and rebuilt by other railroads.
So,
And the engine
Dave,
on the right,
Dave,
yes.
Canadian Pacific is a railroad I model. They're actually rebuilding these into SD70 ACUs right now.
Yeah, that's
two of them. Yeah.
right. They are almost all of them have been rebuilt into something else. They're good kit bashing fodder for a real railroad. On the right is the C44AC, which is on the Union Pacific is the standard bulk train engine. These engines were bought specifically to haul coal, grain, and soda ash trains. And if you see a UP coal train in the 1990s through the 2000s, you're going to see the C44ACs on those trains. Different railroads will see the same engine on a different purpose. Here are two ex-C&W SD38s working as hump engines at North Platte. SD38 was a good engine for a hump. It has a lot of tractive effort. It doesn't need a lot of horsepower. And so they're good just slogging back and forth at 4 miles an hour up and down the hump. Didn't need dynamic brakes. So they were great engines for that. On the other hand, if you've got a Granger railroad that needs for a branch line power, an SD38 might be a great engine for a branch line because it's got 6-axle trucks, so it's got a lot of tractive effort. It spreads the weight of the engine out over a larger area, so it's better for lighter rail and lighter bridges. Non-turbocharged, so that means it has less maintenance. So a different railroad might see these engines in a same engine, different purpose. And then there's different solutions to the same problem. The Missouri Pacific used E-units on its passenger trains, and that fit their operation well. The Missouri Pacific had a lot further distances between stops, so there wasn't a lot of quick starting and stopping, and comparatively had fewer hills than the Reading had, which had a lot of grades, a lot of commuter districts with really close stations, some stations only a mile or a mile and a half apart. So they needed something that had a lot of acceleration and a lot of really quick start-stop. So for them, an FP7 was the answer. So railroads can vary what they're doing based on to have different solutions to the same problem. So let's talk a little bit about who picks the engines. And the system, the railroad itself, the whole railroad decides on the fleet that it's going to buy. How many, what types, what services they're going to go to. And then the system allocates the engines to the different services and says, okay, we're going to put the C44ACs in coal, and we're going to put the SD60s in manifest. But the people that are driving the decisions are the operating department. That's the vice president of transportation, the general managers, the superintendents. That side of the department, the dispatching center, that side of the department decides how the engines are going to be used and how they're going to be allocated. The mechanical department, they manage the upkeep of the engines. They keep them running, and they actually physically build the consist, but the operating department is the one that's calling the shots on what the engines are being used for. Usually, the fleet management function resides either in a central control or in a dispatch office type setting. So that's because the flow is so tied, or the management is so tied to the flow of trains, the dispatch office has the best place to control that. This is a picture of the UP Operations Control Center back in the 1985 or so. And a lot of the locomotive management places that I've been to had a look something like this. A lot of computers, a lot of guys on the phone banging away on computers. So when you are picking engines for a train, there's kind of 3 levels that you need to look at. So let's imagine that we are in the diesel shop at Anna, and we're trying to figure out what we're going to put on the train that runs from Anna to Fay. So we first talked to the yard at Anna, and the yard at Anna tells us, I've got 5,000 tons of business for the train. So we figure, okay, 2 SD40s will haul 5,000 tons. And that, how we come to that conclusion, we'll talk about a couple slides from now. So I need 2 SD40s. And so then I talk to the dispatch office, and the dispatch office says, yeah, but out at Cloy, I've got a pickup of 3,000 tons. So we figure, okay, we need 3 SD40s. And then the dispatch office also tells us that, oh yeah, the switch engine at Dora, the local engine, it is going to be due a federal inspection in a couple days, so I need a swap out engine. So now we're up to 3 SD40s and a GP38 to set out at Dora for the local engine. And then either the dispatch office or OpCon or someone on a system level says, oh, by the way, the grain elevator at Fay has told us that tomorrow they're going to release a loaded grain train. So I need a set of grain train power. So on this railroad, 3 C30-7s is what we're going to use on a grain train. So now I need 3 SD40s, 3 C30-7s, and a GP38 on the train out of Anna. The modelable part of this is it allows you to put a lot more engines on your trains, because you can always say that the extra power is for something downline and you're moving it to that location. But that's how a locomotive, someone planning the power at a yard would look at building the consist. The operating department sets the number in the mix. So that's what we went through in that last exercise. But the mechanical forces pick the specific units. So they'll look at what they have on hand, and they'll see the service track will say, okay, I have a set of 3 SD40s over here. I have a set of 2 C30s here, and I need to find another C30 to match with it. And then I've got a single Jeep 38. And so they will look at what the requirements are, and then look at what they have on hand and build the most convenient set of power that meets the requirements that have been set. The picture here is at Settigast Yard in Houston, and this was one of the power sets that I had them build when I was working assistant general foreman. So you've got a back-to-back local set. So this is a local. It has a back-to-back set of Jeep 38s to pull the train, and then there's a Jeep 18 to set out as a switch engine someplace. And you can tell that we had it's a made-up set because I had them put 2 engines in sequential order, the 2053 and the 2054 on that set of power. Must have been a slow night. So when we're talking about how many engines we're going to put on the train, steam and then the large, big diesel engines like DD40s or your gas turbines or these big 6,000 horsepower engines that they've offered up occasionally. They are large increments in tonnage because they're large increments in horsepower. So that makes the train size and the engine power kind of a step function because you're going up in large increments. On the other hand, if you're using diesel engines, you've got more of a sliding scale. You can measure off as much as you need. So if a Jeep 38 is good for 2,000 tons and an SD40 for 3,000 tons, you can add increments of groups of Jeep 38s and SD40s to basically inch your way up 1,000 tons at a time and get to whatever tonnage you need. If you're running something that's more of a step function, you're going to most likely build the train to match the power. If you're doing the on a sliding scale type thing, you're going to build the power to match the train. In the picture here, this is an SD90 and an SP SD40 tunnel motor pulling an empty coal train through Mo Valley. I don't know exactly what the train is, but because it's that set of power, I can tell you that's a coal train going to store, because they would never put that power on an actual coal train they were going to load. It wouldn't be able to pull it. So earlier we talked about, in the example of the yard, we talked about how we knew that we needed 2 SD40s to pull 5,000 tons. Excuse me. Well, I'm going to go through 4 different ways that railroads figure that out. One of the basic ones is a tonnage rating. So you have a chart, and you have a chart for each route or subdivision or division, and it has the different station segments. And normally these are between either junction points or the crest and valley of hills and that, grades. And it's directional, because whether you're going east or west could mean whether you're going uphill or downhill. And then for each class of locomotive or a group of locomotives, they have a tonnage rating over that section in that direction. And so what you do is you, if you have 10,000 tons and you can go through the chart and see, okay, what is my most restricted area between Texarkana and Sulphur? That's East Texas. It's between Marshall and Sulphur. So I want to base my stuff on there. If I have 10,000 tons, I'm going to need 3 SD40s to pull that. Or I'm going to need 4 GP38s or U23s, or I could maybe get by with 4 GP38s. I probably need 5 GP9s or 18s. So I can use this tonnage chart to figure out how much tonnage I need on my train, or if I know what engines I have on my train and I'm on a particular territory, I can look up and see what their tonnage rating is, find out how much tonnage they can pull, and then I can either add or subtract cars to match that tonnage rating for the train. Tried and true, this was used from the steam era up into the 1980s. This is one I actually used when I worked down in Houston. The other way to do this is what they call a tonnage factor, where you have a tonnage rating for the class of engine, and then for the territory you have a adjustment factor that moves that up or down, and you basically you come up with the same thing. It's just you make the person using it do the math. More modern way is used from like about 1980, and railroads are still doing this today, is a horsepower per trailing ton. You add up all the horsepower of the engine consist, you divide it by the trailing tons in the train, and that gives you a number. And so what you can have is, for example, on a manifest train on the UP east of North Platte, you needed 1 horsepower per trailing ton. So if I have a 6,000 ton train, I need 2 SD40s, 6,000 horsepower, and that'll pull the train and make the schedule. West of North Platte, I need 1.5 horsepower per trailing ton, because you've got more grades west of North Platte than east of North Platte. The higher priority of the train is, for example, a UPS intermodal train east of North Platte would need 2.5 horsepower per trailing ton, and west of North Platte, you'd need 4 horsepower per trailing ton. So if I have my 5,000 ton UPS train going west of North Platte, I need 20,000 horsepower on that train in order to make the schedule. Once you get above 4 horsepower per trailing ton, you're just wasting horsepower because it can't really translate it in there. Now, an interesting thing that I kind of looked at is a quick and dirty idea of how much horsepower you need on a grade. The maximum percent of grade is pretty close to the minimum horsepower per trailing ton. So if I have a 1.5% grade, I need 1.5 horsepower per trailing ton to get the train over that grade. These will be over that minimum, because this intends that it's not just dragging it over the grade, you're actually going to make the schedule over the grade. The problem with horsepower per trailing ton is that it is designed over horsepower and not the tractive effort. The more modern engines with their better wheel slip systems and AC traction and that, were able to, the same horsepower was able to pull substantially more tons with a modern unit. So to compensate for that, they came up with something called tons per axle. And what you do is you rate each of the engines by the number of equivalent axles they have. And actually the default engine was the SD40-2, and that has 6. So compared to an SD40-2, a C44AC has the equivalent of 10 axles. So you look on a chart, you see what engines you have, and then you see what how many axles, add them all up, divide the number of tons in the train by the number of axles you have, and that gives you a tons per axle rating. And so you have to have a rating lower than the goal in order to make the schedule. So a manifest train would have to have 250 tons or less per axle in order to make its rating. This is a lot more complicated, a lot harder to figure out. Basically, if I was going to suggest one for a model railroad, it would be either just the pure tonnage chart or the horsepower per trailing ton. They're way simpler to do. Let's talk a little bit about timing, because a lot of railroading is based on timing. So on an annual basis, the system selects the fleet, and then they tweak the levels and allocate the power and all that stuff on a monthly or weekly basis. They figure, okay, you know, during the month of June, we're looking at having 15 coal trains a day. And then in the month of August, we're going to have 18 coal trains a day and 4 grain trains a day. So they have to allocate their power to the different groups. So they do that on a basis. And now let's look at a train that we're going to operate out of a terminal. And so TD is train departure. So that's the time that whenever the train is going to depart. So the train departure, about 1 to 7 days before the train is going to depart this terminal, they're going to be looking at the inbound power flows and managing them. They're going to be, the further out you go, it's more strategic. The closer in you look, it's more tactical. I pretty well know that on a Thursday, that I'm going to run 15 trains out of my terminal on a Thursday. And I can see it's Tuesday now. I can see that on Wednesday, I'm going to get enough engines for 13 trains. I need to run 15 trains. So I'm going to be 2 sets of power short. So I'm going to be calling somebody up in the system level or the dispatch office and say, hey, can I get a couple extra sets of power? On the other hand, if I'm going to be overpower, some other terminal is going to be calling the same people, and then they're going to call me and tell me to excess power to this other terminal. So that's going on the lead up several days before the train is going to depart. And then about, anywhere from 8 to 24 hours, probably more in the 24-hour range, I'm going to be sitting there figuring out what engines I want to put on my outbound trains. I know pretty much what's coming towards me, because as soon as the train departs wherever, the train coming towards me departs from wherever it is originating, I know what engines are on it, or I can find out what engines are on it. I talk to the dispatch office, they give me a lineup, or else I have a computer, or I can make a phone call to the other terminal. So I know what engines are coming towards me, and I'm starting to pencil in what sets of power I'm going to have inbound, and I'm going to match up with what outbound trains I know. And I pretty much, since I know what the schedule of trains and how many trains we normally operate, I know pretty much where I'm going to have to put the power. And when you get below 24 hours, you're going to start getting some of these actual sets of inbound power are going to arrive. So you're going to have some of this. And by 8 hours before, pretty much all of the engines that you're going to be counting on for that day's or for that next shift's or that next 24-hour period are going to be starting to arrive and be on the property and be at the service track. And you're going to be able to see what's with them. From the 6 to 8 hour window before the train's going to depart, the yard is going to know how big my train is going to be. They're going to know what connections are going to make the train, what connections are going to miss the train. They've got all the cars pretty much in the yard, and they're switching them up and starting to get the cars together. So by then I know enough that I can plan the consist of what it's going to need outbound, and I've got the engines lined up for it. In the 2 to 4 hours before the train departs, by then the yard has set the train. They've got all the cars that they're going to run on that train all switched out, all together in the tracks they're going to build the train in. And they're going to be turning that over to the car department to start lacing the air hoses and getting the air test ready. In the meantime, by that time, I've got the outbound engine consist pretty well built, and it's over in the ready track. 1 to 2 hours before the train departs, either the hostlers will come and get the power, or the outbound crew will come on duty and come to the diesel shop and get the power and move it to the yard, and that'll be in time for the train to depart. Obviously, there are trains that they have on a much quicker basis than this. For example, we had a train that was a run-through train from the Norfolk Southern to Houston, or excuse me, it was a Norfolk from the Southern, at that time it was the Southern Railroad, through New Orleans to Houston, run-through set of power, and that power would come in, we would take it off, put it in the service track, fuel it, put it back on the outbound train, and it would depart back towards Atlanta in a matter of 4 or 5 hours. But that was a set that train always made that move, and it was planned out. And so it was a hot move. You can always have one or two of those hot moves in the yard, but you can't hot move all of the power. Some of it's got to come to the house and be have more stuff done with it. So let's talk about what happens when it comes to the service track. The first thing is, if the yard is tight on power, or in the case of like with the southern train that I just mentioned, you may want to have a situation where you want to flip a set of power really quickly. That's called turning it in the yard. So in that case, when the power would come in, you'd have a machinist look at it. If there were no defects on the engine, if it had enough fuel in it, you would have the hostlers take it directly from the inbound train directly to the outbound train, and it would never see the service track. That's called turning it in the yard. But let's assume that, and this is what happens to most of the power, it does come to the service track. So if the inbound crew or the hostlers bring it to the service track, the machinists go out and they look at the engines and inspect them for defects. Engineers are supposed to keep a defect report that they either leave on the engine or turn in with their paperwork that lists all the different defects that they have encountered with the set of power over the run. So if there's any defects written on that, they'll look at those. They'll physically inspect the engines. Then they look on the back of the cab on the electrical cabinet. There's a little form that is made out of blue paper called the blue card. And the blue card lists all the inspections and when all the inspections are due, when all the inspections have been done and when all the inspections are due. The locomotive is required on a calendar day, once a calendar day, to be inspected by somebody. So there'll be a line on there where each person who inspected it each calendar day can sign off. So they check that to make sure there aren't any inspections due and that the engines have had their required inspections. Then they will put it on the fuel rack and fuel it, water, sand. If it needs oil, they'll check the oil. They put on supplies, paperwork, forms, toilet paper, water, ice, all that sort of stuff. The engines have a toilet in them. They may dump the toilet. My father-in-law was a pipe fitter in a diesel shop, and that's one of his jobs. He had to run the honey wagon. If it's an SD40 or later, an engine has about 1,000-mile range. That's kind of a good rule of thumb. So if an engine has run for less than 1,000 miles, it may not need to be full fueled. You can, for example, it's about 250 miles from Houston to Fort Worth. So I could put a set of SD40s on a train leaving Houston, run to Fort Worth, turn them around, run them back to Houston, and never have to fuel them at Fort Worth. A lot of times, railroads will, if there's a place that has particularly high fuel costs, they will not full fuel an engine just to save money. Or if there's a particular place that has low fuel costs, they may try and full fuel all of their locomotives at that location to get the cheapest fuel on there. If you're talking about a 10 to 15 cent per gallon difference in price, when you're putting 4,000 or 5,000 gallons of fuel in each locomotive, that's a big difference. So once they get done working the engines and fueling them and all that other stuff and inspecting them, then they have to take and cut out all the engines that require inspections or are bad orders. And there's a set of hostlers that work in the shop. They're called inside hostlers that do nothing but move engines around inside the shop. And so they will cut out all the bad orders and all the inspections. And then they take whatever engines are left and start building your outbound consist based on the power plan that has been given to them, and building the outbound consist based on horsepower, the attributes. They'll look at when inspections are due. So if I have if I'm at Fort Worth and I'm running a train to El Paso, that's a 2-day trip out, a 2-day trip back. I don't want to put an engine on that train that's due a inspection in 2 days, because it'll get out to El Paso. There's no shop at El Paso. And so the engine will have to be shut down and drugged back dead to Fort Worth. So I want to put an engine on that's got at least 4 or 5 days a week on any federal inspection, so it can get out to El Paso and back to Fort Worth. So you'll look at when the inspections are due. Once they get all the engines switched out and put together, they'll connect all the hoses and cables between all the engines. They'll do an air test to make sure that all the brakes, the independent and the train line brakes, work on all the engines. Then they'll do a power test to make sure that when the engineer opens up the throttle, all the engines respond and that all the engines are online. Once they get that done, they move it to what's called a ready track, and where it waits to go on its outbound train. This is a picture of the west service track at Bailey Yard. There are actually 3 service tracks at the North Platte Yard. There's the west service, the eastbound run-throughs, and the service track at the diesel shop. So let's talk a little bit about shopping. They've called out all the inspections and all the bad orders. And so now what are they going to do with them? Well, if it's a really minor repair, they wouldn't cut it out. So that could take something that could be fixed on the service track. It might take minutes to hours to fix. So that could be something like brake shoes, air hoses, cables, light bulbs, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So they do those, they'll do that kind of work on the service track and won't cut the engine out. But if it's any kind of more of a repair, it's like a monthly or quarterly inspections, any kind of small repairs that don't need a crane, overhead crane or a drop table, they may take it to a light repair facility or a light repair track and work on it there. This picture is 1754 down here in the corner. That's one of my favorite pictures. At night, and a low angle, if you look down the side of the Missouri engine, you can see the old Missouri Pacific blue and gray paint scheme poking out from underneath the Jenks blue. If it's more a bigger repair, like an annual or a longer inspection or a longer period inspection, if it's some sort of heavy repair that needs a crane or needs the trucks pulled out from underneath it, that's going to take several days to a week. So you're going to need to send that to an actual back shop where they're going to have the machinists and the electricians and the people that are that can do those repairs and have all the parts and the cranes and drop tables and all that other stuff to do that kind of a repair. And then finally, there are the really heavy repairs. That's your rebuilds and wrecks and all that other stuff. Those are going to take weeks to years before they're completed. So, for example, and if you see on a picture of a Missouri Pacific engine, if you see this brick wall in the background, that engine is not long for this world, because that's at Pike Avenue shops, and that's the place they parked all the engines that were going to be disassembled, cut up, or completely rebuilt. One thing is, if you've got a transfer table at your facility, or if there's a shop with a transfer table, whatever's going to be riding on that transfer table, it's probably going to take a week or more for that thing to be worked on and come back out. Transfer tables means that's a shop where it's going to be a long time to get repaired. Here's an example. This is North Little Rock, Arkansas. It's a Hump Yard, major facility. The inbound power comes in from the right. This is a set of inbound engines. They come in through here. They come through this area, which is these 2 tracks here are your service tracks where they're going to get fuel, sand, and all that other stuff. If they need any kind of light repairs, they can be cut over into the phase 1 building here and receive the light repairs. They've got a turntable if they need to get a set that is build an outbound set that is double-ended and they don't have an engine facing the right way. They can turn one. The outbound power is then completed and it's taken back over here in these tracks or over in here as ready tracks to await their outbound train. If they have an engine that needs a heavier repair, this is kind of your annual inspections, your biannuals, et cetera, or any kind of a major repair that needs a crane. They've got the phase 2 shops down here that can work on those. And then if they need something even heavier than that, this is Jenks shop, which is the huge system shop for the Missouri Pacific and then the Union Pacific. The engines come in from the right. They come in, they're put on the transfer table, taken into the shop building. They completely disassemble the engine. A lot of times they'll move, take everything off down to the frame, and then they move all the component pieces around by overhead crane. It's also got a transfer table on the other end where you can bring it out this end and move it over to another shop track and bring it back. They do all the repairs. They can, except for casting trucks and underframes and that, they can basically almost build an engine from scratch in there. They completely rebuild everything, fix all the problems, and then put all the components back together. It comes out over here, goes into the paint shop, is painted, and then right before it's ready to go, it comes down over into this area, which is a load test. They put it on a load test, connect a load up to it, and make sure that the engine is functioning correctly. When I said that if you had a transfer table, it could be months, weeks to years. The years part here is a deadline. Normally these shops have a backlog of engines to be working on if you've got a shop that big. So here's a deadline of dead and dying engines that are waiting their turn to be brought in to be repaired. This whole area over here is the stores department, where all the inbound parts and pieces for the engine and all the scrap metal and that gets shipped out. Quite frankly, if I was going to be modeling a major shop facility, I wouldn't model the shop. I'd model the stores department, because there's a whole lot more activity going on in the stores department, really, than you're ever going to see in the shop building. So let's talk about, that's a good transition into modeling. So how can we use this information for our on our layouts? Well, first off, how you set your fleet appearance can say a lot about your railroad. If you want to project the image of a large, well-run, well-maintained, prosperous railroad, then you're going to want to have a family appearance to your engines. The engines are going to have a fairly consistent paint scheme. They're going to have the same types of same level of maintenance, the same types of horns and light arrangements and snow plows, that type of thing. That's going to be to give it a family appearance. On the other hand, if you want to make your railroad look like it's more of a low budget type operation that had to buy a lot of secondhand equipment and that, you can make your fleet where there's all sorts of variations, where they bought engines from all different other railroads and make it a mishmash of engines intentionally to give it a lack of family appearance, to give it the feel that you want. You can also have different engines that have assigned to different services. So you're going to have buy Jeep 50s for your intermodal trains, and then you're going to have maybe GEs on your coal trains, and then SD50s on your, or SD40s on your manifest train. So you can use different types of engines for different services to create an impression that you've got more going on than you're just putting engines on a train. The allocation part isn't as modelable because most of it happens on a longer term and far away from the actual train. But I'll just say this, that assigning power to trains at the beginning of the session is 100% prototypical, and it happens all the time. And having sets of power that are dedicated to certain trains is 100% prototypical. As far as tonnage ratings go, when you get with trains the small size compared to the prototype that we operate, figuring tonnage ratings really gets kind of funky, and the math doesn't work as well because there's compared to the train size, there's such a big difference between the loaded and empty weight of a car. So I would go with just doing a car count for a tonnage rating. But what you can do is vary the tonnage rating by locomotive class and by direction, where a train going east on your railroad is rated, an engine is maybe rated for 10 cars, but going west, it's only rated for 7 or 8 cars. So that can add some operating interest to your modeling. Something I'll just mention is that engines are water resistant. You don't need to put them in a diesel shop. A diesel shop is not there to keep the engines dry. It's to keep the people working on the engines dry. So if you don't have a major shop at that location, you really don't need an engine house. Virtually every place that I've worked, except for Little Rock, did not have a diesel shop or didn't have an engine house. We just set the engines, sat out in the or Salt Lake City. They just set the engines out in the open, and that's how they lived. Servicing, not every engine needs to go to the fuel rack every day. Your 4-axle engines, 2 to 4 days they can go. If you've got a yard engine or especially a GP engine that has like a GP38, they can go up to a week without being refueled if it's they're on a low, don't have a long run. You know, if they're running on a branch that's only 20, 25 miles long, shoot, they can go a week without needing to be refueled. Once again, a road engine, SD40 or better, you've got 1,000-mile range. Inspections. The problem with inspections is really if you are take an engine and put it in the shop for an inspection, you've basically lost it for the entire session, because most of the time you're not going to get a inspection done in less than 8 hours. However, you can use the idea of inspections to swap out engines at remote locations or to swap out your yard engines, etc. And if you really wanted to up the degree of difficulty, you could have the crew do a check for daily inspections, put a little blue card in the with your paperwork, and the crew would have to check it on second shift around 10 p.m. at night. The crew would have to check to see if their engine has been inspected that calendar day. If it's not, they have to talk to the dispatcher, arrange a spot to stop the train, either a train meet or something like that, and then inspect their engines. You only have to do that if it's been over 24 hours since it left a location with a service track or mechanical people, or if it's a train that's been on the road for more than about 48 hours. I always like this picture. This is the KCS engine house at Heavener, Oklahoma. And the only engine that's in the shop is the outboard motor on the motorboat that's parked in the shop. I guess that's the KCS's idea of a U-boat. And then last but not least is shopping. Basically, if you put an engine into a shop, it's going to take it out of play for the session, because there really isn't anything that you're going to do in a shop that they're going to get back in less than a shift or a day or so. So it's going to be a while. Once again, if you've got a transfer table, you're in reality, anything that has a transfer table, if an engine goes in, it's going to be days, weeks before it comes back out. However, what you can use your shops for is to set a flavor for the condition of your railroad. It can set the tone. Now, this is some of the shop tracks at the Settigus Yard in Houston, Texas, on old Missouri Pacific. And the thing I want to point out to start off with is, I took this picture at about 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning using Kodachrome 64 on a handheld camera. So that'll tell you how bright it was inside, how well lit this facility is. There are a lot of lights. If you're doing this on your railroad, buku LEDs in this scene. So it's well lit, it's bright. Now this is third trick, so there's nobody actually working on the engines. They didn't run a back shop on third shift. So there's nobody actually out working on the engines. But if you'll notice, the walkways are clean. There's not a lot of oil stains. There's not tools laying all over the place. You can even see a shine on the concrete here, on the surface of the concrete. There is wear. You can see there's some little rust and some wear through the paint of the people walking up and down the stairs. And over here, you can see where the air hoses have drug across this crossing and scraped it up. And there's just general wear and tear on the facility for it being a working facility. There's solvent. Here's a hand truck for moving around barrels of solvent, some extension cords and all that other stuff. So you can see there's stuff going on, but it's not wore out. There's not piles of debris and all that other stuff. So if you're wanting to model a railroad that is trying to be a very profitable, very modern, safety conscious, that your shop facilities can make that statement and say, you can have people working on the engines, you can have parts and that, and tool chests and all that other stuff where they're actually working on something. But other than that, it's going to be neat and clean and look like it's been maintained. On the other hand, if you're trying to create the impression of a hard on its luck railroad, or a railroad that's seen better times, running on a shoestring, you can have more debris and more parts with weeds growing up between them and all that other good stuff on there, and use the condition of your shops to help set the tone for what your railroad's going to look like. And so that's about it. If there are any questions, one thing I will say is I have a downloadable PDF of this presentation on my website at wnbranch.com. It's in the how-to section.
Thanks, Chuck. Yeah, there's a few questions in here. So the first question from Tom Bailey: which department decides which new engines are going to be purchased?
The operating department decides that. I'm trying to get out of the presentation here. The operating department is the one that that decides that, and the operating department is the is the one that picks how many engines they need. They do an annual forecast because you have to order engines like a year in advance.
Yeah, I mean, it's
and so
lead time on that stuff.
Yeah, so it's a real long range thing. You have to do you have to do that, well in advance.
Right.
And leasing engines, railroads will lease engines also, and that also has to be done on a long range.
Yep. I would assume most of those leases are 10 years, or
It depends. Some can be a lot. Some can be a lot longer. Some can be
I suppose
shorter.
I suppose there's probably some that are shorter too.
Yeah. It depends on what the needs are.
All right. Next question from Al Dalman in California. On the steam versus diesel and large increment versus sliding scale back in the steam area, would there be some increments like 282, 482, et cetera?
You could do it that way. And I mean, that would be one way of doing it. One of the difference between the steam and the diesel is in the steam area, you didn't have as good communication. So you didn't have the ability to fine tune things quite as easily as in the diesel era. So you would basically say that this class engine would handle this type of train over this territory, and they would just basically run the same engines, and the engine would be sized to about the number of cars they had. The other thing that you have to look at is that you have to power your trains not only for the train going, but the train coming back. So for example, like the classic is a bulk train, a coal train. You need 10,000 horsepower to handle a loaded coal train, but you might only need 3,000 horsepower to handle the empty train back to the mine. But you're still going to have to put the full horsepower on the empty train so that when it gets back to the mine, it's going to have enough horsepower to pull another loaded train out. I don't know if that answers the question.
Oh yeah, and the idea that you can't just, now you just keep throwing more power on and you can still use the same crew. I mean,
that's another thing with the steam era is the steam era, as you add another engine, you add another crew. And back in that day, the crews were the most important part of the most expensive part of running a railroad. In the modern era, actually, it used to be diesel fuel. Diesel fuel replaced it. And then somewhere around 2014, 2015, when the economy slowed down and they had so many engines, basically engines were free. They weren't even counted in the cost of the train because they had so many engines, it really didn't matter.
Got it. All right. So Chuck has a very long question in here. I'm going to skip over that for just a second. Tim Rumpf mentions GE engines required a pit to change brake shoes. Set a gas yard, wire the lights on if nobody's working, waste of dollars / energy.
There are still people out there doing things in the yard, and the night shift is when they clean the facility. So while there's nobody working on the engines, there were people with hot seas spraying down all the ramps, cleaning off all the surfaces and doing that. So there actually were people working in the shop, i.e. I was there, I was
just not on the
but
engine.
there weren't actually people working physically on the engines themselves.
Okay. From Steve Hemmel, turntables and roundhouses are handy for storing locos without using up a lot of switches. Did the prototype use them just for storage between assignments?
Probably not. Most of the time, a roundhouse is a shop facility. It's used to, well, I shouldn't say that. At a major terminal, a roundhouse is used to work on the engines. You put an engine in the roundhouse in order to work on it. Now, if you've got some branch line out there where there's only one engine on the entire line, you might have, like out in North Dakota, you might put an engine in the roundhouse there to hold it overnight so that it wouldn't freeze in the winter. There's some things that you can do there, but in a major terminal, most cases, you're not storing engines in a roundhouse. They're in there because you need to work on them. Or it's where you might use a roundhouse track, like a garden track or something like that, as a ready track.
Got it.
Where you're storing it until it's been worked on, and you're just holding it there until it's ready to go.
Well, and I would think it'd be a lot faster to just pull it off a ready track than to have to pull it out of the roundhouse too. I mean,
Yeah.
you're talking
If you got it, to get it out of a roundhouse track, you need an inside hostler. To get it off a ready track, you just put the outbound crew on it.
All right. If extra engines, this is from Ray Turner, if extra engines are just being repositioned for future use on another train, do they go deadhead/towed, or do they contribute to horsepower for the train they're in?
It depends on whether they were needed or not. If they're truly excess, they're probably idling, but they're running, but they're not online.
Okay. Ian Stronach, sorry if I screw up your name, 1989 CP, I'm assuming Canadian Pacific, operating instructions limit number of driving axles to 16 on 100-pound or less rail and 24 on greater than 100-pound. An exception on greater than 100-pound was a maximum of 8 units operating or dead in tow. Do you have any, do you know why?
Let's see, 9 limited no driving axles to 16 on 100.
I've heard the 8-unit rule elsewhere too. I don't know if that's US as well.
I know that the Union Pacific had you couldn't have more than 8 units on a consist without getting special permission from somebody, the superintendent, to do that.
But I've also seen virtual railfan where they're moving like 32 units. I would assume the bulk of them are dead in transit or dead in tow. Just
a lot of it is due to bridge and axle loadings, because a locomotive weighs more, is one of your heaviest pieces of equipment. And so if you have a whole bunch of engines coupled together, you have a whole bunch of weight concentrated together. And so the problem is just having that much weight concentrated, and having more engines online, you can exert a lot more forces on the rail, and if it's light rail, you can do damage the rail, turn it over or something like that, just because of the sheer amount of force you're transmitting from the engines into the rail.
Got it. And how do the tonnage rating methods take into account very cold weather?
They didn't. They would have, if it's going to be really cold, they would maybe add an extra engine or something like that. A lot of times in really cold weather, what they did is they actually reduced speed restrictions and stuff, and put on speed restrictions.
Got it. Your website was WN Branch, correct?
That's correct. WNBranchAltogether.com.
All right. All right. Let me get to. So you may want to just read Chuck's questions there in the chat window. She's got.
And go up here. I was up here. Chuck Hart.
Chuck.
Destroy his name. Chuck.
Chuck Hack.
Yeah, Chuck. Chuck says another 4 questions. How many gallons per hour does a typical diesel locomotive consume when simply idling in the yard? I knew that at one time, but I don't now. It's going to be, a couple gallon idling, a couple gallons an hour, or something like that.
So let's see.
Are there, since Canada uses a metric system, and I would say No, because they kind of, let's put it this way. I have never seen where that has been an issue, where they have miscalculated the fuel, because basically the fuel supply in the locomotive tank, a lot of times it's a sight glass, and sight glasses don't care about metric or something. If the fuel comes up halfway up the glass, it's half full. So it's not, I can see where maybe somebody might have a problem with that, but I've never run into that.
On the fuel consumption at idle,
Yeah.
it looks like this, I don't know if where this chart came from, but it says an SD60 consumes 3 gallons of fuel per hour at idle.
Yeah, on an SD60, yeah, that sounds about right.
They've got Jeep or SD9 is 3.5. Most of them are somewhere in the
3.
Yeah, 3.5.
Yeah.
There's some that took 5. The C44-8 took 5.5, and the SD45 took 6.
Yeah.
So
back in the day of cheap fuel, you would turn an engine on and it would run for 92 days, and then you would shut it down. And they ran 24/7 until it needed to be shut down to be repaired. Until it went bad order or needed an inspection, it would just sit there and idle or run for days on end.
all right. So Chuck had another question. I'll just read these. When multiple units are coupled together, do they automatically pull in the same direction as the lead unit regarding of which way they're pointing?
What was that question again?
So if you've got 2 engines, one's facing to the left, one's facing to the right, if you turn them both on, do you have to tell them to like slave the direction or something?
Well, what you do is when they hook them up, they indicate which they set switches on the engines to indicate,
Just like DCC, right?
kind of, sort of, yeah. But they indicate it, and the engine knows which way it's going, and so the engines pull equally in either direction. The engine really doesn't care which direction it's pointed. The only person that cares is the engineer and the train crew.
Okay. Second question: if locomotives are with different tractive effort ratings are MU'd, is there a preferred order that they are positioned on the train? Meaning high horsepower first, low horsepower first, I think.
Generally, no. The issue you have on locomotives MU'd is continuous speed. Well, there are 2 things: continuous speed. So if you put a C44AC and a GP7 together in the same consist, if you run the C44AC to its capacity, you'll burn up the motors on the GP7. It will, because the C44ACs and motors can withstand a whole lot more heat and can go down to really low speeds. They can pull down to like a half a mile an hour, and they'll just keep on gutting it out. Meanwhile, the copper is dripping out of the bottom of the GP7's traction motors. So you have to, what happens is if you put an engine with a low continuous rating together or the wrong continuous rating, you could end up damaging the low continuous rating engine. So if you put a passenger engine in with a freight engine, the engineer has to handle it a little differently. It has to watch its minimum speeds and that, because the passenger engine will overheat the traction motors if you load up the freight engine. So they have to watch that kind of thing, but there really isn't that much. If you have dynamic brake and non-dynamic brake engines mixed, you need to put the dynamic brake engine in the lead, so that the engineer will have a control for the dynamic brakes, because there won't be one in the non-dynamic engine. So there's some things like that. If you have a distributed power, you need the distributed power in the front end. So a lot of the add-ons have that. As far as the tractive effort, no.
Okay. Moving on, does it make any difference if AC locomotives are coupled with DC only locomotives?
It can, for the reasons I just said. A AC locomotive doesn't really have a minimum continuous speed, so you can load those puppies up at low speed and they'll just keep on pulling. Meanwhile, your DC engines are overheating. If you get like -9 or better DC engines, the electrical control systems are advanced enough that they can work with an AC and you won't have that problem. But like I said, if you put a C44 AC and a GP7 together, you're actually better off just idling the Jeep7 because you're not going to gain that much.
Got it. Okay, and I think this is his last question. So obviously, as we kind of jokingly say, if you like a railroad, you can always combine it with your own these days because everybody's power runs with everybody else. So the question is, are all locomotives in use in US, Canada, and Mexico compatible so that any engineer qualified on one loco, you know, if you ended up with a couple engines that you don't normally run from a different railroad, are they compatible? Or are they qualified to run any combination?
Pretty much, sort of, yes. On the Class 1 railroads, yeah. Now there are the difference is, once again, it's not so much if it's a really ancient engine with a really ancient brake system. A modern engineer might not be qualified on the throttles of an RS1 or something like that. But for the most part, the answer is yes. The things that aren't the same are things like distributed power, some of the new PTC and other type control systems and that. Some of those things may not be the same. However, pretty much all the railroads now have dynamic brakes. If you went back to the pre-1980s or something, you may not have engineers that were qualified on dynamic brakes on certain railroads. You may not have had, if you had run-through power that had distributed power, you might not, every crew on another railroad might not be qualified on distributed power. So there's potential for that, but generally they're all pretty much compatible.
Yeah, pretty compatible these days. So
I could say yes, and then that would immediately cause people to find all of the exceptions.
Yeah.
That would be the easy way to find the exceptions. I'll just say yes, and then that'll uncover all the exceptions.
Yeah,
they are out there.
You start sounding like my friend the lawyer, where every answer is it depends. You know?
Yeah.
All right. So
like I said at the beginning, there's probably an exception to every single thing I've said in here because it is such a broad category.
Exactly. Tom Kane asking, thinking in terms of model train railroads, what experiences are operators having with providing protection or extra locos for trains that might present problems?
The biggest barrier to that type of thing is that I see is if you're going to have, the really cool thing would be to have them add units and subtract units. You know, pick up a through train comes through, stops at a terminal, picks up a set of local power, carries it out to our grain train power, picks it up, carries it out to some location, sets it out to originated grain train. The challenge is, do you want your model crews to consist and unconsist engines? If they're qualified at that, that would be a really cool thing. if they're not qualified at that, it can, you know, from a model railroad standpoint, it can cause problems. But generally, I work under the assumption that anything that allows you to buy more locomotives is a good thing.
Yep. Yeah. All right. Well, I think we've got everything. We're a little bit over time. So Dave, thanks so much for presenting.
Thanks for having me.
I'll add a link to your website and to the presentation on the notes. That'll go up with the YouTube page and so on. But otherwise, we'll thank everybody for coming, and we will see you the next. So upcoming events, as we said at the beginning, I have to go out of town in 2 weeks, so we're taking that month, or that session off. The next session will be Sunday, I believe it's the 12th, Sunday the 11th, Sunday, July 11th. And yeah, I know the national convention is the week before, but it's not like you're traveling anyway, so come on. So July 11th, the following Sunday for OPSIG members is the annual meeting. That will be at 7 p.m. on Sunday the 18th. That way we're trying to accommodate all the time zones. That will be recorded, of course. And then August the 8th will be a session, and we'll continue sending that reminder so we don't have people showing up when there's no session. But and we do have presenters out through the August session, but if you'd like to present sometime in September, we'd be happy to have you. You can present either for a half hour or an hour, as Dave just did today. We'll take either one. We just have to get it arranged. So with that, thanks for coming, and have a good day.